Coming up next, we're going to sit down with foreign affairs expert John Ubaldi. He's going to break down the presidential candidates and their foreign policy plans for us. We'll be right back with that and more. Welcome back to Political Connections, everybody. I'm Ruechel. When we talk about foreign policy, how much do we know about it? Maybe not as much as we could or should. And joining me right now to talk more about what it means with foreign policy is a man who's written a book called The New Business Brigade by John Ubaldi. John, thank you for joining us very much.
Hey, thanks, Tom, for having me on the show.
You're a veteran. Give me a little of your background first before we start talking about foreign affairs.
Okay, I spent 30 years in the Marines, did 3 combat tours, 1 to Iraq and 2 to Afghanistan. I received my master's degree in national security studies, and my strong concentration was in the Middle East.
Americans, I'm going to say this because I've been overseas a lot. Anybody who knows the way they cover the news there. In many ways, Americans are clueless when it comes to foreign policy. Why is that?
Well, I think it's 2 reasons. One, we have these 2 vast oceans, and we only see what we see in our country. We think the world revolves around the United States. The second reason is the candidates and our elected officials never explain what the role the United States plays in foreign policy. This election, you see trade is a big issue. Trade has a great impact here, but you see the arguments that they're playing, each side plays to their base and doesn't really discuss and explain to the American people how foreign affairs affects policies back home.
And when you went, if you would ask somebody, well, tell me what you think about our foreign affairs, I will guarantee you the first thing they talk about is terrorism or the Middle East and those kind of things.
Those are the 2 top issues, but also now, because of the election, when they say terrorism or overseas, why do we care? Let's focus on here in America first. And when we do that, every time America retrenches inward, we pay a price overseas.
Now, some people will say, wait a minute, this is the Americas are the policemen of the world argument again, versus, you know, can't we just mind what's going on here? Like it or not, we tend to be the policemen of the world.
We are, and that's what the role we assumed after World War II. The problem is we focused foreign affairs on military. If you listen to the candidates on both sides, it's either use the military or not. The military realized there's so many other things that we could use. There's diplomatic, there's economic, there's our intelligence, there's engaging with our allies, but it's always the military option comes first. Doesn't matter who you talk to.
All right, let's talk about some of the specific areas. I'm going to ask you to describe inward, if you can, what is our foreign policy toward, and there will be 5 areas that we're going to look at. Middle East, what is our policy there?
That's confusing. I mean, there was a report that came out with Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic, and the President Obama came in to repudiate what George Bush did. He was more activist in the Middle East. The President wants to step back. Now, people can argue that's correct or not, but we've kind of almost been disengaged, and our allies know we've been disengaged, and now they're looking at Russia and other outside powers to fill that vacuum, and they're not going to have our strategic interest at heart.
Let's talk about Russia. Now, before we talk about Russia, we interviewed Marvin Kalb, longtime correspondent for CBS and NBC News, and he said, once KGB, always KGB. Correct. In describing Putin.
Putin is, I know from the interview, he was a KGB officer, but he looks at Russia as what's good for Mother Russia. The President looks at Putin that we can deal with this guy. If he just acts rationally. So we got to look at how he sees the world. He wants to get Russia back on the international stage, and he's done a great job at it, from the Ukraine, Crimea, in his involvement in the Middle East, what they've been out of the Middle East since 1973.
Yeah, now they're back in Syria, and now supposedly sort of leaving, but they're keeping a couple military bases.
They're keeping the 2 military bases, but they have direct influence. They've got everything stabilized to what they want to see stabilized. So they're heavily involved. They're leaving some point, but they're staying. Another
foreign policy issue, despots. Whether it's Iran, whether it's North Korea, on and on. No longer Cuba on that list anymore. Correct. Venezuela, or there's other countries. So,
with
North Korea.
With North Korea, that goes back and forth. I mean, they spring up every so often, so we still don't know how to deal with that issue. China's our great leverage there, but they're fearful of a spillover of their refugees into China itself. So. That's an interesting dynamic on that one.
And when we talk about China, we don't talk so much about military, but we are talking about economic trade, because, like it or not, the U.S. and China are inseparably joined at the hip.
They are. They have a lot of our debt. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a direct relationship against China. A lot of these countries wanted to join with us, and for us, that makes us more engaged in the Asian Pacific area. But that has a controversy with this presidential election, especially in the Rust Belt states.
Let's talk about another area that people talk about when you talk about foreign policy is Israel.
Israel's interesting. That goes, everybody believes that we've been back in Israel from day one. That's been an evolved process. I mean, President Truman did back the creation of Israel, but he and Eisenhower kind of played back. They wanted to get more of the Arabs on our side, not Israel. And then it just evolved from there, from Kennedy to Johnson and to where we are right now. Now, Barack Obama has a very contentious relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu.
Well, that is for sure.
And he's looking at Iran to be part of a regional power, that these countries have to just deal with Iran in that area. And that's why those countries really have a problem with us.
And then I've heard it said if there's ever going to be a flashpoint, it could be surprise with the Saudis and Iran.
That's correct, because the nuclear deal that was signed, that just infuriated the Sunnis. At the same time, Saudi Arabia had leaders from Pakistan. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. They could give the Saudis the technology to build a nuclear weapon. And then you see the last few weeks, Iranian missile test, and we didn't really do anything about it. Now, the United States went to the Security Council to put sanctions back on Iran. That's not going to happen because Russia and China won't. But Iran is going by the nuclear deal. They changed the verbiage to allow them to do this. As much as we want to complain, Iran is correct. They have the right to do what we did.
Right.
That was the agreement.
And thus you have Donald Trump who says that the Iranian deal is the worst thing that we ever negotiated. Okay, we've only got a couple more minutes, so let me see if you can, I'm going to mention each one of these candidates and just kind of give me a general rundown of what their foreign policy is, from what we know.
Okay.
Let's start out on the Democratic side. Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State.
Hillary Clinton would be more of an activist for foreign policy, and that's what she was when Secretary of State as a senator, because she voted for the war in Iraq. But the problem she's going to have is she's tied herself so much to President Obama, the Middle East, especially the Iran nuclear deal, and especially recently, she's going to have a very difficult time in dealing with our allies, especially when the president criticized David Cameron of England and the Saudi Arabia as being free riders.
Oh boy, yeah, and that's the way he uses it, to try to encourage them financially to do more.
So she would have a very difficult time.
Bernie Sanders.
He would be disengaged from the world. He says he wants to defeat ISIS, but at the same time, he pivots. I didn't vote for the war in Iraq, she did, and he moves back to domestic. So I believe he would be disengaged, probably even more, almost parallel to what Barack Obama's doing, pulling us back, let other regional powers take over.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump is a wild card. Nobody knows what he's going to do. He said that he wants to be more of a militarist. He'll bomb ISIS. He'll do all these other things, and that's scared a lot of the defense officials, especially on terrorism, how we would conduct interrogations, and some of the other things. So he's more of a wild card. Nobody knows what he's going to do.
Right, because you don't know whether this is just inflammatory language, as Trump often has done in his histories. He tends to exaggerate way over to one side, but then you don't know what his actions would be.
And then we don't even know who is advising him. In the last debate for the Republican Party, he did mention he listens to Jack Keane, the former vice chairman of Chief of Staff, and some others, but they've never been mentioned that he's been with them.
Right.
So we really don't know who he listens to or what he would do.
And Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz is a strict conservative. He would use the military. He said that we will bomb him into make the sand glow.
Right,
the problem with that, neither Trump or Cruz has mentioned what replaces ISIS. They never give a comprehensive view of Syria, Assad, Russia, Iran, Iraq, all the players in the region, Turkey, all have competing interests that don't align with us.
Man, this is a puzzle. It's so complicated. And lastly, John Kasich.
John Kasich would he would use the military to a degree, but I think he would more or less use other elements, almost all of our national power, and at the last resort would use the military. But none of the candidates, and I looked at all the candidate websites, are not clear what specific areas they would do. And Donald Trump really doesn't have much on his website except for a few issues.
Yeah. So last question, does it make the world nervous not knowing what our foreign policy is? Does it make them nervous that our foreign policy has changed so much in the last 4 years?
It doesn't make the world nervous, it terrifies them. When they see the United States disengage, they get scared because they may criticize us, but they know the United States is that linchpin that keeps everything together. And when they see Russia expanding, they see China in the South China Sea expanding, and the United States isn't doing anything, they see Iran acquiring the ability to get nuclear weapons with these missile tests, it scares the world.
Yeah, the world is a safer place when the U.S. is involved in some way, shape, or form.
And again, not everything needs a military option.
That's true.
We just need a global vision, what we needed, almost like what Eisenhower had his presidency.
Yeah,
he
absolutely.
had a vision.
Well, the book is called The New Business Brigade, Veterans' Dynamic Impact on U.S. Business. Kind of a different subject than what we've been talking about today, but if it's anything like our conversation that we've had today, it's good stuff, John. Thank you for stopping by.
Thanks a lot, Val. Thanks for having me on your show.